Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So, as you all know, this is the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policies panel on COVID-19 and the restaurant industry. And we're going to be surveying some legal obstacles and opportunities. My name is Elizabeth Yu, and I am a student co-chair at the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, a law student and a longtime restaurant worker. We are joined today by Jess Cytryn, who is a lawyer at McCarthy Tétrault, the president and co-founder of the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, member of the Operations Committee of the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, and a co-founder of the McGill Food Law Society. We also have her co-organizer, Kaitlin Doucette, who is a sommelier, a restaurant worker advocate and activist, the co-founder of the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, and co-founder of the Canadian Restaurant Workers Coalition. Kaitlin is also pursuing a master's degree in human systems intervention at Concordia University, with her research in precarious labor, trauma embodiment, and organizational change. And finally, we're joined by Mike McLellan, who is a partner at Crawford, Shondon and Partners LLP in Ontario. Mike specializes in employment, labor, and human rights law, and previously worked as in-house counsel at the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, or most commonly known as the LCBO. Great, so welcome to all of our panelists. We're going to start off. I would just like if each of our panelists could give a very brief description of your role within the food and restaurant industry landscape and how that role has changed throughout the pandemic. So maybe if we could start with Jess.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Liz, and also all of the people who organized this panel. It's a really cool topic. I'm into it, so happy to be here, happy to talk about it. Like Liz said, I'm a lawyer at McCarthy Tétrault, but I mainly service food and alcohol clients and some retail clients. So a lot of my clients felt all clients felt the impact of COVID, I think, but I think the ways in which my clients felt it are relevant to this panel. So I got a lot of insight into the changes in the food industry as felt by industry during COVID. And in respect of how COVID changed I'm also a longtime restaurant worker, but stopped that a few years ago. So I should mention that my heart is in the restaurant industry. But in respect of how I felt COVID and restaurants, Kaitlin and I founded the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund like the day after people stopped going to work. So that was definitely the biggest way that I personally felt it, and we'll probably get into that later. So I guess I'll let Kaitlin piggyback off my introduction.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for organizing. Always grateful to have a platform to talk about the concerns and reality of restaurant workers. The pandemic changed my personal life very, very dramatically. Like many restaurant workers, I lost my job a very long time, kind of career track job where I'd been for 5 years as a buyer. I co-founded an organization called the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund with Jess. And then in December of 2020, I co-founded an organization called the Canadian Restaurant Workers Coalition, which is more of a national body aiming at representing restaurant workers at the federal and provincial level. From there, it's been a big, to use the cliched word, pivot. So went back to school, did some kind of more formal training to support the type of change work and organizing that I'm doing my master's. In tandem, bringing that lens of organizational development at the spot that I'm currently at, which is a forthcoming brewery, where I am doing that kind of organizational dev, strategic planning, support work for the labor force. So it all kind of worked out in the end. There was some highs and lows, really bumpy ride. And then of course, my purview on the industry at large, which we'll get into a little bit later, has radically changed because of some of the struggles and challenges that restaurant workers have faced, and myself and my community in the last 2 years.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Mike McClellan. I'm very happy and pleased to be here and hope I can provide some good information. I have a 9-week-old baby, so I'm very, very tired. I work in a law firm called Crawford, Shondon and Partners. We're based in Brampton, Ontario, with some locations in Barrie and Sudbury, and I represent employers in all areas of workplace law in all sectors and industries, really. I do have clients that include restaurants, bars, and food service, logistics. Certainly the pandemic brought up new challenges for all my clients, but particularly in the food service industry, dealing with mandatory closures leading to layoffs, or are they layoffs, aren't they layoffs, or leaves of absence, human rights, and people who think they have human rights, and health and safety, and people who think they have health and safety issues, vaccine and PPE policies, and really trying to get up to speed myself on what was required in the province and in the industry, and helping my clients understand what their obligations and entitlements were. So including things like implementing proper policies and addressing a lot of myths and misinformation. There certainly has been some tension amongst some consumers, some workers, certainly some business owners, and unfortunately some other lawyers. I had the opportunity to speak with Restaurants Canada on a few occasions to try to address some widespread, some of it misinformation, some of it maybe just innocently mistaken information on things like PPE, face coverings, and vaccine policies. So it's certainly been a busy time, an interesting time, and looking forward to getting things hopefully a little bit more back to normal in the coming weeks and months.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everybody. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with a little bit of a regulatory focus, actually. So we were curious to find out if you could give us, and this is probably towards Jess in particular, a little bit of a high-level overview of some of the regulatory changes that were fast-tracked during the pandemic. We're thinking in particular liquor sales and delivery and those kinds of things, and patio permits that I know that restaurants were petitioning for a very long time and always seemed impossible to achieve. And then in a very short amount of time, they happened. So.
Yeah, sure. So for a little more info on what I do, I focus a lot on Quebec alcohol, like the Quebec alcohol regime. So a lot of the examples that I'll give are based on the Régie des Alcools and Quebec, but we've seen a lot of these changes come in all the different provinces. And everyone on the call probably knows this, but alcohol and the sale of alcohol and the service of alcohol is regulated province by province. So it's not, well, it is regulated at the federal level for certain things, but each province has its own provincial regime. And so things can vary a lot between provinces. So I'll talk a bit about Quebec and try to draw comparisons to other provinces where I can. The big ones, you mentioned some of them. So alcohol delivery being one of the most significant ones that came out of the pandemic for restaurants. And that's like, I think across most provinces. So in Quebec, in 2018, they passed a bill that proposed to allow third-party delivery services to deliver alcohol on the part of restaurants. We're thinking Uber Eats, DoorDash, Skip the Dishes, etc. So that was a nice thought in 2018, and everyone was for it and everyone wanted it, but I guess they dragged their feet for about 2 years, and then the pandemic hit in March 2020, and the government decided to accelerate the adoption of those provisions that they modified but generally adopted in principle at the end of 2020. So that became law in December 2020. You can order all your wine on Uber Eats now. It's fantastic. Maybe not for all the restaurants, but for a lot of people who are happy about it. other than delivery by third-party services, we also saw in Quebec, if you grew up in Quebec and have been drinking in Quebec for a long time, you know that you can't go to a restaurant and only drink, and they make you get like $1 pasta or whatever it is. I see some recognition nods. So now, since December 2020, you can go to a restaurant and have a glass of wine without needing to order food, which is a really big change that Quebec restaurants were waiting for a very long time. And it stemmed from a very antiquated, old school kind of prohibition mind law that we're all very grateful that they changed. So not only can you go to a restaurant and order a glass of wine or a bottle of wine or a drink without a meal, you can also go to a restaurant and take out wine or get delivery wine or beer or cider with food prepared by the restaurant that is not necessarily a meal. So this, to me, is the most exciting change because it allows for new business models. So if you can get a restaurant license, you can essentially become a bottle shop, which is something that couldn't exist in Quebec at all in any form before. So that's really exciting that you can have a restaurant that's really a bottle shop that just sells like chips with bottles of wine. So that's pretty cool. Those are two examples of changes that were already contemplated before the pandemic hit and were just accelerated because of the pandemic. But then there are like a bunch of other changes that came, and it's not quite clear if they're permanent or not. So for example, there's a lot of confusion around what Liz said, which is like the patio permits. So patio permits are difficult because they're municipality by municipality. It's not a provincial decision to allow patio permits. And so depending on where you are and depending on the zoning in your municipality, you may or may not be able to obtain another. And when we say it's like sidewalk permits, like they were really kind of like makeshift terraces that were not permitted, that were just like tables on a sidewalk. And some municipalities are moving forward in the commercial zones to allow for that to happen again, and some are not. And it's kind of like luck of the draw, which is really unfortunate. But we're going to have to see. It's just like a wait and see situation, since it's not a provincial decision. And even it's not a Valérie Plante, like it's not a Montreal decision, even though she might be alluding to the fact that it is. Like I know she was campaigning a bit on allowing for patio permits, but it's not really in her jurisdiction to make those decisions. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens with the sidewalk permits. I have some more notes. Oh, another exciting change that is applicable to restaurants in hotels is that you can now, as a hotel, apply to have common areas covered by your existing permits. So if you have a restaurant that has, let's say, 3 different restaurants and a bar, you can now buy a glass of wine in a restaurant and enjoy your glass of wine by the pool or in the lobby. If the hotel has applied for a common area permit. So that's not true for all hotels. The hotel has to have applied for it. So that's really exciting, like an increased flexibility of enjoying alcohol throughout a hotel or a resort. And you can even like buy a glass of wine in the restaurant and move to the bar, or vice versa, which I guess would be more common. But that's an exciting change. Another change that we saw during the pandemic was a lot of bars switched their permits to restaurant permits because bars were not allowed to be open, like point blank, for a long time. And so the Régie des Alcools offered an expedited service to allow bars to switch their bar permits to restaurant permits. And now that restaurants can serve alcohol without food, it's going to be interesting to see whether these bars, whether these used to be bars who are now technically restaurants, choose to switch back to bars or choose to stay as a restaurant. There are a few differences between the two permits. There's pros and cons on either side. Just like as an example, minors can't go into a bar, but you can add a no minor qualification to your restaurant permit. So if you want no minors, but maybe you do want minors, so it depends on your business. But it'll be interesting to see whether these businesses choose to switch back or choose to stay, and how that may or may not affect our alcohol regime. The other changes that I think are temporary changes that came during the pandemic, I already mentioned the sidewalk terraces. Another big one is the flexibility that was introduced for wine import agents. So, for example, during the pandemic, you could get like wine mix packs, or you could get wine delivered to your home by wine agents. You can't do that anymore. So we'll see if that becomes a flexibility that stays. And I know that's not directly related to restaurants, but I think it eats into restaurant alcohol sales, especially now that restaurants can be like quasi wine bottle shops. So we'll see if wine agents are allowed to have more flexibility going forward. And the last thing in terms of alcohol and alcohol delivery and kind of restaurants generally was that the Quebec government and the Ontario government and a few other provinces introduced a cap on the fees that third-party delivery services could take, and explicitly said that that would be temporary, and it's not clear. I don't know if someone on the call knows what's up with that in Ontario, but it's not clear when that will be lifted, or if it already has been. So depending on the province. Those are kind of like the regulatory changes that I jotted down before the call. They're very skewed towards alcohol. So clearly I'm not as au courant with the others, although it's worth noting, and I think like the elephant in the room is like the huge supply, like in addition to the labor issues, which we're about to talk about, the like huge supply chain issues and the increase in price for absolutely everything, from takeout containers to food ingredients to labor to transportation to everything. So that's also something worth talking about maybe later. I think that's it for me for now. I talked long enough.
That was great. That was so helpful. That was so helpful, and that was so interesting. I think you talked a lot about increased flexibilities in these expedited processes. I think for our next question, we would like to know a little bit more about whether or not you think that this builds momentum, whether there will be increased flexibility going forward, or if it was really in a pinch, an emergency situation, they created this flexibility. And I think maybe Kaitlin can speak to this as well, but if there is increased flexibility, what other things are restaurants looking for? What regulatory changes? Because I know that sitting down and drinking without eating has been asked for a million years. And there are other hot topics that restaurants were advocating for that they didn't receive. So two-pronged question. Do you think that this is going to incite sort of a regulatory flexibility for the future? And if it does, what changes, regulatory changes, would the restaurant industry probably like to see? And that's for all of you, so whoever wants to start.
I mean, I can chime in more so just speaking on kind of worker impact. And I'd like to preface that by saying, you know, even though I'm here kind of representing somebody who works with workers, who is a restaurant worker, that workforce is incredibly diverse and has, you know, very divergent views on a lot of things. So by no means is what I'm saying monolithic. That being said, you know, the it's really interesting to reframe this as like a trickle down effect of what does that regulatory flexibility mean for workers on the ground. And so some of the things that Jess proposed, you know, and was talking about are great for the industry, but that doesn't necessarily transmit into change for, you know, the workers of it. So, I mean, what does the industry need holistically? A lot of things. There's a lot of regulatory things that even with the CRWC, we're working towards advocating for. Sometimes, you know, we've seen with our work that the interest of owners and workers can be very much in lockstep, and sometimes those are very divergent, just because of the nature of the different needs and demands. So I think that's just an important distinction to make, to add another prong to your two-prong, Liz. But I don't know, Jess, if you'd like to speak on some of the regulatory aspects.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I think that this means increased flexibility, and not just in terms of the changes that already happened. So I don't just mean like, oh, we can eat without drinking, drink without eating now. But I think that if we look at the changes that we just achieved, so like drinking without eating, allowing for third-party delivery service, these are things that people lobbied for and pushed for many years before they came into place. And now that we have them, it'll just be something new, right? Someone or a bunch of different interested parties are going to start lobbying for the next thing and pushing for the next thing. And because alcohol regimes, which affect restaurants immensely and their bottom lines immensely, because they're so strict in Canada and especially in Quebec, there's a lot to push for and a lot more flexibility to be obtained. So yeah, absolutely. I think that people are just going to push for the next thing now, and it's going to eventually, we will obtain that, and then so on and so forth. So yeah, I see a lot of potential, and there's a lot of potential to operate creatively within the new regime, like the concrete change of allowing restaurants to sell takeout wine with chips or whatever it is, to allow hotels to have alcohol consumption in common areas. Those are really exciting changes that, if business owners are creative about them, can lead to really exciting new ways of consuming alcohol and making money in the restaurant industry, for a lot of people. So it's exciting.
Great. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add to that. But if not, we'll go over to I think a labor-focused question, labor employment. So I know, Mike, you had mentioned that there were certain things that Restaurants Canada was dealing with, in particular vaccine policies, vaccine mandates, PPE, and obviously, Kaitlin and Jess, you work for, you co-founded the Montreal Restaurant Workers Relief Fund, and Kaitlin, the Canadian Coalition of Restaurant Workers. I was wondering if you could all speak to some of the challenges that the restaurant industry has faced in terms of labor, employment, and the pandemic. And maybe if we could start with you, Mike, in particular, I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on the challenges that you were discussing with the Restaurants Canada.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like all industries, the pandemic has been a real game changer for clients in the restaurant and bars and food services industry. Just kind of a really technical legal point just to get out of the way, because I am technical and legal. Labor law per se refers to the unionized workplace. It's a subset of employment law, and that's unionized workplaces are not very common. In my experience in restaurants and bars, a little bit more so in some food service workplaces. But with respect to employment law, certainly saw some big changes, and I'll touch on a couple of issues that came up quite often. We'll talk about kind of your gold standard fundamental employment law, health and safety, and human rights. These are kind of the three big areas where I think my clients have seen the biggest impact. With respect to employment law, it's been really, really unfortunate, obviously in a number of ways the pandemic has, but from a business perspective, that restaurants and bars could not operate. The Ontario government, for example, had its list of essential workplaces that were permitted to remain open, and restaurants and bars did not make the cut. That resulted in a number of long-standing and successful restaurants shutting down for good, which is really, really sad. And others did and are doing the best they can to wait it out and in return taking advantage of things like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy and workers taking advantage of the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit where they could. But still, we had a question about the end, or maybe constructively or interpretively the end of people's employment, layoffs and terminations, which was understandable because any employee who is terminated on a without cause basis is entitled to notice of their termination or pay in lieu of notice of termination, either under the employment standards, labor standards, legislation of the jurisdiction, or under the common law. We've had a slew in Ontario of court cases. I shouldn't say a slew. We've had a few court cases come out in Ontario contradicting each other about whether an employee who remained off of work for longer than the statutory temporary layoff period was in fact terminated, and if so, do they have their common law entitlements to pay in lieu of notice? And like I said, contradicting outcomes there. This is a tough one. Certainly, if the businesses are shut, the employees are not getting their what they've bargained for in their employment contract, which is to be able to come to work in exchange for compensation. I have great sympathy for workers who have lost their jobs, and I do think that workers who have lost their jobs during the pandemic should be entitled to and should count on being able to get some compensation. It's odd to me that an employer who is told you're not allowed to operate during these conditions will be told by a court that pursuant to the common law, you are responsible for your pay in lieu of notice of this employee as you would be during normal times. It's a little bit odd to me because, and I've spoken on this and written some articles on this. The whole point of the common law, in my view, is to reflect the circumstances of a particular case. And how many times have we all heard these are unprecedented times? Well, why aren't we getting unprecedented legal decisions to reflect those unprecedented times? Obviously, that's my bias in terms of favoring and supporting employers. But it's been a really tough one to navigate, and you throw in changes to labor standards allowing statutory job protected emergency leaves of absences for deemed or declared emergencies or infectious disease emergencies. It makes it a little bit more complicated to process what the right outcome will be, other than it certainly highlights and emphasizes what I tell clients all the time. When you hire new employees and you're not working under a collective bargaining agreement, you really should consider having individual contracts of employment put in for everyone you hire that outline what are an employee's entitlements on termination, and what are an employer's responsibilities, and what is the employer's authority to put somebody on a temporary layoff, and can we at the outset dictate what an employee's entitlements on termination will be in a valid and enforceable way that complies with our jurisdictional legislation for employment standards and limit litigation. So it certainly has highlighted those key elements that I'm always advising employers to be cognizant of with their staff. I mean, look, we all love our staff; they're our greatest asset, but realistically and legally, they're also a liability. And I hate to say that, but that's the business and legal reality, and we have to be alive to that. Health and safety, especially really early on in the pandemic, when we weren't quite sure what we were dealing with, we had a number of employees saying that even where a workplace remained open, before mandates and restrictions and things of that nature, saying that they didn't feel safe coming into the workplace and they wanted to invoke their right to refuse unsafe work. The right to refuse unsafe work is it is a right guaranteed by, again, in the applicable jurisdiction, either the labor standards, employment standards, or in the case of Ontario, the Occupational Health and Safety Act itself. But it's never been applied to a situation where an employee feels really subjectively unsafe. It typically requires the applicable labor ministry to step in and do an investigation and see, like, okay, is there actually a risk to this person's health and safety that we can discern on a little bit more of an objective basis. So, but understandable if an employee says, I don't feel safe coming in, particularly if they were, immune or compromised, or they had a family member who was vulnerable. Well, okay, what can we do to work with that? And that kind of led us to the third heading of human rights. And, one recognized human right is, or a prohibited ground of discrimination, I should say, is family status. If somebody has a family member who is maybe vulnerable, or who has COVID, or has to be at home, a child who has to be at home from school because they are, there's a closure of the school. There's a human rights principle that says we have a duty to accommodate our employees up to a point of undue hardship for things such as their family status obligations. And beyond family status, we obviously have things like disability. So if somebody comes down with a case of COVID, they would be entitled to some form of accommodation, which typically takes the form of job protected time off of work. Kind of similarly with, if somebody's gone out doing the responsible thing and getting their vaccine, and then they get the side effects and feel so crummy that they can't come to work. Well, it's really not fair that they would be disciplined, for example, for something like that. That is technically a human rights accommodation to say, yeah, okay, take a couple of days, rest up, feel better, and then come back. You've got your job waiting for you. But we've also got some guidance on what are not human rights. A person who is simply anti-face covering does not have a human right to not wear the required PPE when it's required for health and safety purposes. And if I had, clients with, people working in the kitchen, and frankly, I have a lot of daycare clients, and I've got one or two chefs who say, hey, it's too hot for me to wear a face mask in the kitchen. Well, you've got to wear your face mask in the kitchen. We'll find a way around it. We'll find a way to be a little bit flexible. We'll find a way to give you some break time where you can step outside, take your mask off, take a breather, get some water, and then come back to work. But human rights tribunals across Canada have been clear that barring a medical reason, and I think, theoretically, a religious reason, there is no human right to be free of a face covering in a workplace that requires it. And then similarly with vaccines, I can appreciate that some people might not want to take the vaccine, and if that's the choice you make, I think that's your choice to make it. It's not the choice I would make. But I think the law is also pretty clear that barring a medical reason, which medical reasons are very limited, that is a choice and that is not a human right. So, there's a lot of dealing with, sometimes patrons, sometimes workers who are asserting rights that don't actually exist. And unfortunately, sometimes those rights that don't actually exist are being supported by people who you would think know better. That's where I'm happy to comment and advise businesses and business organizations on, what their obligations really are. If somebody does say that, if somebody is asserting a human right, okay, well, we've got to take a look at it. We have to ask the right questions and go through the right process to see if there's a duty to accommodate up to the point of undue hardship. But yeah, I would say those are the three real headings of workplace law that have developed the most during the pandemic, or most had the most applicable changes in certainly newsworthy legislation and decisions. Your employment law in terms of layoffs and terminations, occupational health and safety, and human rights.
It looks like Liz is frozen.
I think she is. I'd be happy in the interim to speak to a couple of points that Mike outlined. And I'm really happy, it's always heartening, Mike. I appreciate you naming that a lot of the things you were going through had a level of opacity to them. I'm glad to hear that a lawyer feels that way, because workers certainly do. And I think one of the greater challenges, speaking, I'm happy that you named as well that you're kind of coming more in on the employer side, because I'm coming on the opposite. And one of the larger issues, speaking to, the health and safety, the capital H, capital R, human rights concerns you outlined and things like that, is that liability that workers are treated as is that often. And it's quite egregious sometimes. So I understand that there needs to be protections on both sides. Small business can't survive without labor. Labor can't survive without small business, particularly when we're talking about, the type of restaurants that Jess and I often work with, or the type of workers that we encounter. But I mean, the reality is, unfortunately, that a lot of ownership runs with that. So what we're seeing kind of on the worker side is a real challenge in terms of folks kind of manipulating things, or putting workers who, are already often part of marginalized groups at further risk. And there's not a lot of legislative safety net for those, workers who are fundamentally underpaid, who are exploited in other ways. So it becomes a real challenge kind of finding, like you were saying, that middle ground where there's equal protections on other sides. But the sad truth is, on the employment side, on the worker side, we've seen a lot of abuses of some of these things, even things like restaurant owners withholding. And I'm not saying this is everybody, of course, for every restaurant owner that is happy to protect their worker and doing everything they can to keep folks safe during COVID. We've seen restaurants withhold ROEs from workers so that they can't file for CERB or CWLB. This is the reality of it. And those are folks who are perhaps indebted to the owners or things like that. So there's a lot of complicating factors that make it really challenging for workers to get a little bit of control legislatively and a little bit of protection. Liz, did you catch on to all that?
I definitely caught the tail end. Sorry about that. My Wi-Fi failed me. But it sounds like you were giving a very enlightening overview on the difficulties of restaurant workers and the realities on the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. Thank you. And Jess, I'm not sure if you wanted to touch on that at all, or it's very okay if the answer is no.
Well, it's just restaurants, like I don't know anything about employment law, and I'm going to leave all of this to Mike. But from the perspective of someone who processed thousands of applications for financial aid from workers in Quebec, or in Montreal actually only, what's really interesting about restaurant workers is that first of all, there's a lot of unpaid labor. And so when an emergency hits and you can't prove that you've been working, those people are unfortunately kind of left to fend for themselves, which was really sad to see. And the other quirk about restaurants is tipping. And so and a lot of cash tips. And so again, when an emergency hits and you can't document how much money you actually make and how much money it actually costs you to live your life, because you haven't been declaring hundreds or thousands of dollars a month for several years, that's really tough. And I think that, or I hope that the pandemic has shed a light on the importance of declaring your actual revenues to people. And I know that not everyone is a big fan of paying taxes, but like it's really important to paper your income properly. And I hope some people learned that lesson, hopefully not the hard way too much. And so that was kind of like something I noticed that was really sad. And the other thing is that, like Mike said, a lot of restaurants have closed, which is really sad. But that kind of makes it, and a lot of at the same time, like we all know there's a big labor shortage, and even more so than restaurants closing, there's a big labor shortage, which makes it a labor market where you have to make your employment more appealing than someone else's. And I think that that's a really, really exciting thing for the restaurant industry. And I'm really looking forward to see how restaurants and bars and other food service establishments, hotels, caterers, whatever it is, adapts and makes their offer of employment more competitive than their competitors. And I think hopefully the industry kind of comes out of all this a better place to work, if just a little, because it's not always the most fun place to work. So yeah, and like as an aside, it's just funny because my partner asked me this the other day. We were talking about someone being really rude to one of my colleagues, and he said, what's the like most rude someone has been to you at work? And I looked at him straight in the eye and I said, it doesn't even come close to when I worked in restaurants, like on another planet. Like, so it's not the easiest job. And yeah, I hope that this makes it a little bit better for the future.
Definitely. I'm sure there's probably quite a few people who are on this call who have worked in the restaurant industry, and I saw a lot of nods. It's definitely not an easy industry to work in, and especially not when there's a global pandemic. So I think all of your perspectives are really helpful in kind of seeing a broader picture of what the labor challenges have been like in terms of both from the employment side and having to obviously institute mask mandates, vaccine policies, vaccine mandates, and then from the workers' perspective, where when they are employed, the challenges of going to work every day and the increased risks that they're facing, and when they're not employed, how tipping has really made things like applying for EI borderline futile. But I'm wondering, as we're moving towards a new point in the pandemic and perhaps what everybody is calling this new normal, obviously there has been a lot of organizational support, and there's been, as both Kaitlin and Jess alluded to, a bit of a shift of power, or a shifting of bargaining power, perhaps, on behalf of the restaurant workers. And I was wondering how you all envision this transition to the next stage of the pandemic will look like, in terms of how will restaurants be able to bring workers back? What are worker demands? And I don't know if, Mike, you could speak from an employment side of whether or not people have been thinking about benefits or sick days or healthcare, various things that have notoriously been absent from the restaurant industry. And anybody can go ahead and jump in first, whoever wants to.
Yeah, sure. I think it's interesting that you use the term shifting of power. I wouldn't say we're necessarily there yet. We're working on it slowly but surely. I think, there are concrete measures that we've seen some restaurants, and Jess touched on this a little bit, and you did too as well, Liz, thinking about things like paid sick leave, thinking about things like living wages, thinking about things like vacation, oh my gosh, or other things related to working in the industry that can be supportive for the workers. I think that's the future. Unfortunately, I don't think everyone is aligned with that future. I do this work for advocacy because I think there is a future for the restaurant industry that is better. And I hope to help be part of that shift and be part of that movement. But unfortunately, there's not alignment necessarily there. But I can attest that even from a employer side, because I do work in management and I do work in specifically organizational development with an up and coming project, that in order to retain labor and to get qualified candidates, you need to start thinking about being competitive, which I don't think is necessarily a negative thing. Workers are looking for safer, better places to work that offer some of these things. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it means that, we have to kind of work towards that. Otherwise, to be totally frank, like if your labor is not equitable, why bother? We talk about small business and the importance of small business, but the workers are the backbones of those small businesses. So we often triumph these, independent restaurants, and as we should, they're fantastic cultural touchstones. But it's the people that power them that make them go, right? So I think it's really important that we be aware of that shift and we kind of push it as much as we can moving forward. I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of how things end up shaking out. Because I know even, we're offering quite competitive packages and it's still difficult. A lot of people have transitioned out of industries, transitioned into different roles. But I think that just means that we need to be smarter and think of, ways to offer advantageous workplaces for folks. I don't think that's too much to ask, to be totally frank.
Yeah, I'll tread lightly into this one. And Kaitlin, I do appreciate your perspective. And it's, before I went to the professional world, I was a worker myself for a long time. So, hearing somebody advocate for workers is something I really like. And I'll also say that, business owners who want to save a buck by stiffing their employees are certainly not hiring a lawyer, because we cost way more than their employees do. So luckily, I don't have to deal with those kind of employers as clients, because frankly, I wouldn't. I am interested to see what happens, particularly in the restaurant and bars sector of our economy. Certainly there's a labor shortage now, but there's also a work shortage. I mean, we're just starting to see in Ontario a lifting of mandates. And by the way, while I fully appreciate and agree with, face coverings and vaccine passports, I really sympathize with the people-facing workers who are suddenly thrust in the position of trying to enforce these policies. Very, very difficult. Restaurants are notorious for having very, very thin margins. So it is profit margin. So it's going to take some creativity and flexibility for restaurants opening up. And I don't know how it's going to work. I don't know if there are so many out of work individuals who are going to be willing to come back to a restaurant job simply because they've been out of work or underemployed for so long, or if it's going to be, I don't want to return to this kind of work before. I hate to sound jaded, but I'm sure that some of my clients, and I'm not going to say in the restaurant industry, but I know some of my clients had people collecting CERB that was more than what they were able to make through employment, but that was the nature of the job. Now I know that that's not a benefit that's still around. So, you know, I'll be interested to see what happens. Just because of the economics of it, I don't think the answer is going to be that employers can pay more money to the workers necessarily, because it's still the same amount of hours of work to be done. You know, unless, you know, the prices of food get increased to pay employees more, which I'm sure is going to have to happen. But then it's a matter of, well, what will the patrons do? Will they keep coming to restaurants? So, you know, I'm not, you know, I don't say that I have the answers, and I'm not sure there's, you know, the right answer is whatever gets people back to work and lets businesses thrive. And I just don't know what that's going to be at this stage.
Right, and I think to speak to, you know, some of the stuff, particularly CERB, it comes out to about $13.50 an hour, which is not a livable wage in most cities. So it's definitely a challenge. It's a puzzle piece. I agree with you, Mike, about where does that extra, you know, dollar amount come from. But I know personally, I would rather be in a culture of eating out less and paying people more fairly. But obviously, you know, Jess, you touched on supply chain issues and increasing prices. It's a hell of an equation. But I think, unfortunately, that equation has come at the cost of workers for a very long time. And so maybe it's time to right that balance. I don't know what that looks like. I totally agree with you, Mike, that I have no idea looking into the midst of that. How do you make that work? But I think that what the pandemic exposed is, if, you know, folks can stay home for $13.50 an hour and make more than they would at their restaurant job, makes sense to me, and stay safe. So I understand why folks would be reticent after that to come back, or and how do you entice people after that? It becomes really challenging.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike and Kaitlin. Jess, did you want to add anything to that, or no? Great. One thumb up. Good. Yeah, it's definitely such a challenge. And I think, coming from the perspective of having worked through the pandemic and seeing so many of my coworkers transition out of the restaurant industry because they found that CERB was more lucrative, and then that they didn't want to return to work that wasn't offering them much. There's definitely a challenge facing the restaurant industry and moving forward, and in creating incentives for an increase in individuals to re-enter the workforce there. Yeah, I think what we'll do now, we're heading towards 7 p.m. So we'll open the floor up for questions, unless anyone had something that they wanted to bring up, either from a previous question or that was just burning in the back of their minds when we were chatting. We're good? Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions.
While people are asking their questions, if they're putting them in the chat or whatever, I would have a question for Mike, which is just like something I just thought of and haven't thought through at all, and is maybe irrelevant, but
No, not a trick question.
You know, it's not. I know that Ontario is proposing like what they're calling, and what is not technically, a right to disconnect. And I'm wondering like how you see that applying to restaurant workers, or if it would, or if this is an irrelevant question.
I think this is, and thank you for asking this, and you can read my blog on it on the Employer's Edge at
Oh, great.
ccpartners.ca.
Sorry, I didn't Google it before.
I think it is smoke and mirrors an election season ploy. Yeah. There is no right to disconnect that didn't already exist. It's been being called right to disconnect, which is odd. Really what it is a requirement that employers who have 25 or more employees as of January 1st in the calendar year write and circulate a disconnect from work policy. But that's it. What that right to, or what that disconnect from work policy entails is not constrained by anything other than what's already in the Employment Standards Act, which is really just how many hours a day and how many hours a week can someone work. That's it. With respect to the restaurant industry, I don't know, do they get, I'm not familiar with my clients sending a lot of communications outside of work hours to their workers other than, talking about shifts and whatnot, but it certainly wouldn't go beyond, statutory maximum hours of work that I could really imagine. So I think it's a pretty useless amendment overall. I think it sounds nice in a headline, and I think it was a ploy to get some votes in June, and I don't think there's anything really behind it. Not that I'm jaded or anything.
Thanks for that.
Great. So participants can ask questions either by raising your hand. You can put in the chat. And I see that Khadija has actually asked a question here, so I'll just read it out loud to our panelists. And she says, thank you so much. I'm curious, and picking up on accurately filling your taxes that you mentioned, Jessica. Tax filing season has just started. What sort of benefits exist for those in the restaurant industry which are COVID related? What sort of tax related challenges may those in the industry face this year? And I think this is probably alluding to, a lot of industries received work from home tax breaks and things like that. So I'm not sure if anybody can speak on some tax related challenges.
I am the wrong person to answer this question. I'm so sorry. I don't know anything about tax. My partner is a tax lawyer, but I'm not, and I don't feel comfortable answering the question. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I can answer some very anecdotal stuff. Not much. There's, and what I've seen recurrent from the restaurant worker community, particularly those who were accessing benefits, more so for the last fiscal year, perhaps less now. I'm not sure about the taxation rates on CWLB for folks who access that, is that a lot of people, like I was saying, wasn't a living wage in a lot of cities. So most people were exhausting those funds and not keeping things back for clawback. So we saw some really brutal taxation things going on last year for folks who are already in a precarious situation. So I think that just goes to writ about this kind of the way in which precarity compounds upon itself, and the way in which legislation and taxation in this instance, for example, serves to do that, and how that already impacts communities that often face a lot of other kind of complex marginalization. So that's not exactly facts and figures, I'm sorry, but I hope it speaks to some of what you were interested in.
Yeah, I think anecdotally as well, but following CERB, there were so many people who were in the restaurant industry who were taxed because it came to workers untaxed, and there was maybe a lack of understanding of that, and they hit big amounts that they owed come tax season. And I think for the CRWB, the lockdown benefit, workers benefit, they're taxing it now prior to handing it out. So they're trying to avoid that misstep that happened at the beginning, but yeah.
Glad to hear that.
Yes, yeah. It is a diminished sum, but it's taxed. Yeah. Great. So we have Laura, who is asking that when we talk about the need to make restaurants more appealing to workers in order to address potential labor shortages, what role do minimum labor standards have in this conversation? In particular, should responsibility be on employers and allowing them to preserve independence in choosing minimum labor standards, or should there be maybe a legislative or a policy shift? And maybe anybody can speak to this, but Mike, you might have insight on any kind of legislative rumors.
Yeah, so in Ontario, the the general minimum wage has just increased, or it has increased to $15 an hour, which, you know, I'm all in favor of raising responsibly and incrementally the minimum wage. But, you know, I can tell you what drove my clients crazy was in the last government announcing the minimum wage was going to go from $10.40 to $15 in the span of a couple of months. Business owners weren't ready for that, and kind of freaked out a little bit. But anyway, you know, and the minimum wage for, as I understand it, your restaurant and bar workers is raising along with that. I think the natural consequence is going to be obviously, you know, more costs to the businesses, and that's going to get passed along to the patrons, and hopefully there are enough patrons coming back to the restaurant to make it worthwhile. And then I kind of wonder, well, what is your average patron going to do when food prices go up and they know that the restaurant workers are making more money under legislation than they were before? Are they going to be you know, leaving the same gratuities, or is it going to be more of a European model where you know, patrons understand that compensation is built in for the servers or the restaurant workers, and you know, so they don't leave tips. You know, the answer is probably a little bit of both. I think there has to be some legislative changes to favor workers, to get them back in the workplace. And I think that employers are going to have to get creative with what they can provide to their workers. Maybe that's not a direct cost to the employer, but makes a better workplace and work experience for the worker. You know, and they could do things like, you know, more favorable hours of work, you know, vacation time. You know, I'd like to say benefits, but again, that's another cost, and there's a whole you know, economy behind that, and whether it would make sense. But yeah, I think the answer is there's going to have to be a mix of initiatives from legislature and business to kind of restore the restaurant business.
Yeah, I think, you know, kind of to speak to two of the points, the minimum laborers absolutely have something to be said in the conversation. Part of the issue with restaurant work is it is a bit of the Wild West in terms of regulatory policies to start, and then the application of them is even wilder, I can say. So I think having some kind of provincial standard in regards to minimum wage can be a huge help to that. We've done a lot of work with organizations, with the CRLC, with organizations like Justice for Workers or 15 in Fairness, kind of speaking to this issue. Of course, that's one piece of the puzzle. And I totally agree with Mike, what he was saying about the ways in which employers can get really creative about offering not perhaps even non-monetary compensation to entice workers and to create better labor standards. So I think it's two-pronged. I would be wary of leaving it entirely in employer hands. I think there is a regulatory aspect, just to ensure that there's, you know, minimum standards, but I definitely think there's a hand to be played on both sides.
Yeah, Kaitlin, I've actually got a question for you, and I don't know if you can answer this. You know, reading in my local newspaper, or you know, a restaurant in you know, the town where my main office is, you know, just got, you know, absolutely taken to the cleaners for failure to pay. You know, a student worker who's not from Canada, and you know, that's the kind of story that just makes my skin crawl. And hearing what you're saying, Kaitlin, about challenges that a number of restaurant workers face in getting fair compensation and getting, you know, getting their what they earn out of the bargain. You know, maybe part of the answer is enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a huge aspect of it. And that was, you were speaking about PPE, for example, earlier, Mike, something that Jess and I worked on a little bit around consciousness raising efforts with the MTLRW, so many acronyms, was, speaking to workers about PPE and just like what kind of standards they could rely on to ensure that it was enforced. And we're talking height of the pandemic, like before, pre-vaccines, we felt relatively safe hanging out without a mask on. And there was just no level of, we're having the province and the feds say, keep your mask, keep your distance. And this is just one anecdote, but workers, when you had that chef who, having his hot flash or whatever you were talking about earlier, who wants to take off his mask, and he's your boss and there's no one around to support you. We saw a lot of transmission, and it's an unfortunate statistic, but there was a study, I think out of UCLA, I can dig it up after and send it out for whoever's interested, that some of the highest rates of death from early COVID were in line cooks in the US. That's a devastating statistic. And that's just one example of way that enforcement can really shield folks and workers from true dangers in the workplace. And that, that's anecdotal, but I think that can be extrapolated in a lot of instances.
Great, thank you so much. I think this question will probably spill over. Lori has asked something that was relevant to our conversation that we were just having, but she asked if you can comment on gig workers who are doing restaurant deliveries. Where do they fit? I think probably in the framework of worker protection, and are they considered part of the Canadian Restaurant Workers Coalition? And I think everyone is well aware of the fact that delivery workers really, especially in Quebec during the curfew, during the intense lockdown, carried the restaurant industry in such a significant way and truly became our co-workers. So yeah, if anybody could speak to that.
Yeah, gig work is complicated, not in terms of, like you're saying, that solidarity, but in terms of who, where it belongs, so to speak, and who kind of takes operative control of that. To answer about the CRWC is a really grassroots organization made up of workers, owners, different folks in the industry who, at the beginning wanted to support our 3 petition asks, but now would like to join us in kind of our advocacy work for the industry at large. So to speak to the point of our gig workers included in this, yes, absolutely. They are restaurant workers, they're part of it, but we're by no means a regulatory body or anything that makes distinctions about work. We're just a scrappy little organizing committee. So of course, and I think, gig workers, to speak to your point, Liz, are absolutely our colleagues. In fact, a lot of our colleagues became gig workers. So I think there's a real conversation to be had there. I think the sudden boom in gig work, particularly by the pandemic, has really also highlighted a lot of the challenges there. But again, this remains this kind of nebulous zone for a lot of employment stuff. I don't know if Jess, you can tease that out a little bit more, or Mike.
I'll let Mike chime in if he wants to. My dog is making lots of noises, so.
One thing I would add is that legally speaking, more and more gig workers are being deemed to be employees and not the independent contractors that I think certain platforms expected them to be. And if I go a little bit more, labor employment law nerdy on you all, boy, I think there really was an ability to have a true gig sector of independent contractors, and working for Uber, Fedora, Skip the Dishes, things like that. And from an employer's perspective, there's certainly some attractive qualities to that, and it could have happened. But when you look at the control that these companies wanted to exercise over the gig workers, I think it makes it pretty clear that they weren't going to be independent contractors, and so they are employees and they ought to be treated as such. And the provincial government in Ontario just announced another bill proposal to supposed to be for the benefit of digital platform workers. But legally speaking, they would be employees under the Employment Standards Act, and this new bill doesn't quite meet the thresholds and the standards under the Employment Standards Act in Ontario. So I have another criticism for our current provincial government, but that's what I can contribute to this question.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that was a great contribution, because our next question is about legislative safeguards that are being put into place. So Shubi is wondering if there are any legislative safeguards that have been or could be proposed to further buttress the resilience of the restaurant industry in the face of any potential future upheavals, either in service delivery, access to labor, cost of resources, and et cetera. And I think we touched on this before, but we're seeing supply chain crises, we're seeing inflation and general precarity, I think, in our future. In short, should be summarizes, are folks in the restaurant industry expected to build this capacity themselves as part of the cost of doing business, or is there overarching governmental support in this direction?
I think there's both. I think the government tried to help restaurants a lot during the pandemic. I mentioned a few of those ways earlier on in the call, having to do with alcohol sales and trying to make restaurants more money from alcohol. But you also see lots of, like, in the same way there was served for workers, there was a lot of money that was handed out to restaurants, rent support, things like that. That being said, I think there's a bit of, capitalist flair to all of this, which is like, there were and are a lot of restaurants. Do we need this many restaurants? I'm not going to share my opinion on that, but, I think that some people or the government takes the approach that it's okay that some restaurants or businesses in general close, and we'll see who comes out of this, and then they can try to make it work for themselves to a certain extent, because it's also Canada and we like helping people. But yeah, I think there's a bit of both of those things going on here. I feel like Mike has something to say. He's like on the cusp of.
No, well, I mentioned earlier an organization called Restaurants Canada, and they are an advocacy group for restaurants across Canada, hence the name Restaurants Canada. But in terms of advocating for the industry, they are one group that I would point to, working really hard, trying to keep businesses going in restaurants, bars, and food service.
Yeah, I think to touch on what Jess was saying, I think that capitalist flair is quite exaggerated. Unfortunately, I had a meeting with the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability last week. And, there's definitely still ears to be bugging about these issues. And it was interesting, some of the feedback we got that, they are hearing more and more about workers' rights. And so I think there is a push to be done. There are the CRWC was founded kind of as a complement to an organization like RC, like Restaurants Canada, which does tend to work a little bit more on the employer side. I think there's a conversation to be had there. And I've spoken on panels for RC and worked with them before. But I think what we really need to do is kind of expand this conversation to be more inclusive. I definitely think, to speak to the aspect of buttresses, I think, people are doing it for themselves. We're seeing that, I'm speaking as somebody who does mutual aid work with Jess. my dream, and I always say about my advocacy work, is I advocate that I can go into retirement and not have to advocate anymore. But I don't think that's coming anytime soon. So I really think it's important to, you know, keep writing those letters, keep it in the news, keep these things important and close to people's hearts, because that's how change happens.
Thank you. I was wondering personally, if there are legislative safeguards that are proposed, what you might imagine they would look like. Either, I know, Mike, you said that the bill proposed for gig economists for delivery workers wasn't up to par, or if there are any other legislative safeguards for workers or restaurants.
Sorry, I don't have an answer for that. I just know it was more PC government smoke and mirrors in an election season. So
that's fair. That's fair. I don't know if Kaitlin or Jess, you could speak from the workers' side of if there's any legislative change that workers had been advocating for.
No, like we're facing conservative governments across Quebec and Ontario. So as Mike says, you know, I share in Mike's, to put it gently, skepticism about our leadership. But I haven't seen any significant gains either at the federal or provincial levels. I think the most novel innovations have been programs like CWLB and CERB. But as we're seeing, you know, CWLB rolled out in the most recent wave of closures in the face of the Omicron crisis. A large part of the folks doing worker advocacy were just calling for how insufficient that was. It was even less than CERB. So I think there is a volition to pivot and recognize that this industry in particular is in a precarious spot more now than ever. That being said, I think maybe the nimbleness with which they pivot is not quite there yet. The agility is not there.
Very fair, very fair. Okay, we have two more questions in the chat. So Julia is wondering, she says that there's been a lot of buzz about sick days, and Mike mentioned it briefly, and she noticed that the CRWC's Instagram mentioned wanting 10 paid days recently. And she's wondering if you think that the pandemic has shifted the discourse on this or other health benefits in restaurants. Especially interested in the answer as the vaccine mandates and mask mandates are beginning to lift across the country.
Yes, so in regards to paid sick days, I think a really important thing to talk about when we're situating the conversation around paid sick days is this gathered steam during the pandemic because we were in the face of a global deadly virus like we had never seen in our lifetimes, and even perhaps more than that, actually. So this is really kind of something that we're looking at as a holistic health measure to stop the spread of other things, to allow people also just like decent and dignified lifestyles, which I don't think, again, that's a hill that I'm willing to die on. So I think it's really something that in terms of creating architecture for supportive and progressive labor that does allow people to have dignity, that does allow people to rest when they're ill. 10 paid sick days is something that we're shooting for as kind of a minimum. And there has been a lot of steam. There's a lot of other organizations. By no means is the CRWC the only one asking for this. You know, 15 in Fairness comes to mind, Decent Work in Health. There's a lot of local and national organizations that are really working in lockstep to see this across industries, particularly precarious industries. So I think there's lots of work to be done there as well. And I think that really needs to be decontextualized from a pandemic circumstance, because sickness and health is important in the best of times. We just got the worst of times for about 2.5 years now.
Yeah, so in response to the pandemic, and Caitlin's absolutely right, it was one of the things that the government did correctly, in my view, is recognize the importance of people being able to stay home from work when they're sick, and part of that is they need to get paid. Um, you know, again, it's for practical reasons, it's tough to talk about paid sick days. In my view, if the sick days are to be paid directly by the employer. There's employers out there who could do it. There's a lot of employers out there who really can't. What's happening in Ontario is that if an employee is entitled to infectious disease emergency leave, the first 3 of those days are paid. The employer pays the employee their daily wages or $200, whatever is less. Then the employer can get reimbursed through a program that's being run by WSIB. If we can increase that program from 3 days to 10 days, for example, then I would be all for it. If the responsibility falls squarely on the employer, that you have to pay employees who are not coming to work, it's a little bit tougher to swallow. The whole point of having an employment contract is the worker provides work, the employer provides money. The employer typically, legally speaking, doesn't provide money when they're not getting work back. That's even in human rights principles when it comes to accommodations for people who can't come to work. It's a pretty fundamental principle that if you're not working, you're not entitled to be paid because you're sick, because you have some other obligations that mean you can't come to work. So I'm very, definitely agree. Let's keep people home if they're sick. I don't want somebody sick coming to a restaurant and serving me food. No offense to anybody. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, I just don't think it's fair or makes sense legally to put that onus directly and solely on the employer.
Yeah, and just to speak to Mike's point, because I think it's important with the CRWC, we do actually, our advocacy, Mike, does aim at getting that federally and provincially sponsored in recognition to the challenges to independent businesses. I'm of 2 minds of that, as on a personal note, not representing my organization, because I do think there is some of that cost can and actually should be shouldered by employers to create an increased responsibility. However, in meeting with MPs and ownership and, all of the above, it's another challenging kind of puzzle piece, because of course there's the issue of who pays, who picks up the bill. But I think it's just an important distinction I wanted to make, that the CRWC does actually advocate in line with what Mike's speaking about there. And I think that's the most realistic, to be honest. I think Mike touches on on some good points there.
Yeah, thank you. I think honestly, when we see something like COVID-19 enabling such a vast increase in paid sick days for restaurant workers, like if you had COVID, you applied to directly to the government, and they immediately put money into your bank account, like it showed the possibility of that. And now we're just looking for, I think, political will and momentum, probably. Very quickly, we have 3 minutes left. Lori has a question. If you wanted to touch on this question or just give a wrap-up statement. Lori is concerned that if we go through the model of just letting restaurants weather the storm, that will just end up with larger chains and lose many mom and pops. So how do we balance worker rights with supporting locally based economic development? Do we need special incentives and supports for small local businesses? Again, if you can either touch on that question or just give a brief wrap up in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah, to speak to Lori's question, I agree about incentives, and I agree about speaking to the nature of independent commerce. I think it's really important. I'll lay my cards on the table here. I am a restaurant worker by trade because my mother is a restaurant owner, and she owns a small establishment in rural Quebec. So I know well the trials and tribulations growing up in a single parent home, supporting from, literally somebody's working the line 6 days a week. So I think it is really important to maintain that focus. that not all ownership, even within that independent structure, is created equal and has the same kind of equal footing. So I think incentivizing is really important, particularly if we do want to keep our vibrant food cultures and local foodways alive, because particularly thinking about independent restaurants, they're the ones that support the farmers that are using the products locally, not those conglomerate and chains. So I think you touched on some really important points there, Laurie. So thanks for that question.
Okay, great. If we don't have anything else to add to that question, I wanted to thank our panelists on behalf of the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy, on behalf of law students who are eager to hear about both the industry and legal perspectives, and thankful also as a restaurant worker that you're all advocating and working in this field. So I think that wraps everything up. Again, this is a recorded conversation, so it will be posted to the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy website, and we will be also posting in the Facebook chat, or the Facebook event, a link to that. So we have several thanks coming in from the chat, and with that, we will close the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.